This podcast is based on the German podcast Föhr nach New York, Eine Auswanderergeschichte. Föhr to New York, an immigration story. By Honig&Gold, NDR Schleswig-Holstein and the Ferring Foundation of Föhr from the year 2024.
Föhr to New York, an emigration story. This is the second episode. If you haven't heard the first one yet, it's best to start with that one.
There were 3 houses in our street. Only white people lived there, and the others were all black.
Hi, I'm Bente Faust. In this podcast, I tell you the story of my grandparents, Inge and Hermann, who immigrated from Föhr to New York and later came back to Föhr. I spent part of my childhood with my grandparents on Föhr. By the way, I called Inge Uhlmann, which is the Frisian word for grandmother. On Föhr, people speak Frisian, or more precisely Ferring, which is the Föhr dialect of Frisian. Note, Frisian should not be confused with Low German. They are two completely separate languages. Uhlmann he Ferring med mig snakat. Uhlmann spoke Frisian to me. I speak it too, but I'm still learning, as I grew up speaking mostly German. For this podcast, I went in search of traces of my grandparents and visited the places where they lived in New York. I talked to relatives and friends in New York and, of course, on Föhr. In this episode, I introduce you to my grandfather, Hermann. He died when I was 7. But I can vividly remember him sitting in front of the house in Süderende on Föhr, plucking ducks, or how I used to go with him to the mud flats to fish in the fish traps. He was the nature boy type, black hair, tanned skin. Apart from that, he liked jazz and usually had a cigarette in the corner of his mouth. While Inge explored her neighborhood in Harlem in 1927, and made her first acquaintance with bubblegum chewing American girls, her later husband Hermann goes fishing with his friends on Föhr or has to help with the potato harvest. Hermann grows up on Föhr in Süderende, the neighboring village of Inge's birthplace Olsum. Süderende and Olsum are not much different. Dikes, sheep, horizons, thatched houses. There were about as many people living on the whole island at that time as on one street in Harlem. What a contrast, Föhr and New York. By the way, I once compared these two worlds in terms of sound. As a musician and podcast maker, I'm naturally interested in how something sounds. Here you can hear me in New York.
Wir stehen hier jetzt am Frederick Douglass Boulevard in Harlem, New York City, vor der Hausnummer 2360, wo Uhlmann gewohnt hat.
And this is what it sounds like on Föhr.
So, jetzt bin ich hier nochmal in Olsum, vor dem Haus der Ketelsens. Es ist kurz nach 2, Samstagnachmittag im Mai. Schönes Wetter. Es ist ziemlich ruhig.
Föhr to New York, an emigration story. A podcast by Honig&Gold and the Ferring Foundation of Föhr. This is the second episode, Dikes, Jazz, and Delicacies.
In 1927, when Inge arrives in New York, Hermann is 9 years old and lives with his parents and a little sister in a thatched house with a stable and barn. A small farm, in fact. Hermann misses his 3 big brothers, Teddy, Joe, and John. They are considerably older than him and emigrated to New York a few years ago, like so many people from Föhr. Their real names are Johannes, Jürgen, and Theodor. But when they arrived in the USA, they gave themselves new names. Names that sound more American and are easier to pronounce. Almost everyone did this. Everyone who came to New York from anywhere in the world.
One by one, the brothers left the North Sea island of Föhr. They are very young, the youngest just 16 years old, when they set off for the New World to start a new, better life. Teddy, Joe, and John visit Föhr every few years and talk about the big wide world on the other side of the Atlantic. Hermann attends elementary school in Oldsum. It takes him about 10 minutes to walk across the fields to school. Occasionally, he has to help around the house, but mostly he can do as he pleases. It's a dream childhood. Like in Astrid Lindgren's books, Hermann's friend, Eric Reverts, wrote down his memories for his descendants.
The main playground for us children was the main street of the village. We played skittles here, limpkins, with marbles, which they called löpen. But we also ran around in the fields. In the spring, we looked for various birds' eggs, kibitz or crows. In the summer, I spent a lot of time in the marsh and caught pike with set nets. The ditches were still brimming with water. We always went swimming at the Dunsum Dike, barefoot of course, as was usual in summer. But I never learned to swim very well. Sometimes we crawled through a small hole in the church tower and then climbed up fragile ladders to fetch young jackdaws, which we brought home with us. We also pulled many a prank. Our neighbor, Tedure Jappen, always had strawberries in her garden. There was something for Christian and Lorenz, who sometimes got through a hole in the fence. Tedure must have noticed this and put up a sign saying, "Thieves' Entrance." Christian later renamed the best entrance.
Tedure had a sense of humor. We'll hear more about her later in the podcast. She was an important player in the Föhrer community in New York at the end of the 19th century. Life on Föhr at the beginning of the 20th century is primarily characterized by agriculture. There was already tourism, but the fine ladies and gentlemen stayed in hotels and lodging houses with water closets, which were only available in the island capital of Vik. It is only 11 kilometers away, and yet a different world. There, bathers stroll along the beach promenade. As a village boy from Süderende, you rarely come here. Some islanders even only go once a year, in October, to the fair. Although it's true that all the children on Föhr go to school, at harvest time they have to work. The women are constantly busy, cooking food, stocking up for the winter, salting, making sausages, preserving. And of course, cooking and ironing laundry. The animals also have to be looked after and milked. The men work in the fields from spring to fall. In the warmer months, the working day begins with the first cock-a-doodle-doo of the rooster and ends with the setting sun. The days are long. Whereas in winter, the long evenings are spent resting. The women, the old people, and the children sit together in the parlor at dusk, doing handicrafts and talking.
The Rickmers family home is the largest in the village after the vicarage. Jürgen Rickmers, Hermann's grandfather, has made his fortune through seafaring and had the house built for his son wohin for his wedding in 1896. There is no electric light yet, but otherwise it is quite modern. High ceilings, several ovens, and a small cellar.
wohin also went to sea. Of course he did. For many centuries, there were few alternatives to seafaring on the island. But when steamships arrived in the 20th century, the great age of sailors was over. Now, many island Frisians are following the trend of their relatives and friends and emigrating to the USA. Just like Hermann's older brothers, most of his cousins, his uncles, and even his father, wohin. They all lived in New York for several years.
As he is growing up, Hermann is fascinated by the adventures of sailors. He hangs pictures of ships above his bed. His obsession with seafaring goes so far that he once climbs into the attic and tampers with his famous grandfather, Jürgen Rickmer's, sea chest, carving his initials into it with a penknife.
And it was precisely this sea chest that I found in the attic of the Rickmers house in Süderende in 2011. Among old furnitures, cobwebs, under a thick layer of dust, Jürgen Rickmers was written in squiggly letters on the box. But I didn't know at that time that he was my great-great-grandfather and how he had been blown across the oceans. I had climbed into the attic by chance. I had offered help when the house was being cleared out. And in the end, the box was the impetus for me to produce a podcast about Jürgen Rickmers in 2021. The podcast is called Jürgen Rickmers Through the Storms of the 19th Century. But now, back to Hermann.
Hermann hopes that his desire to become a sailor will be understood by his strict father. Hermann's older brother Joe, who actually wants to become a farmer, is the first to experience this. But according to his father, wohin, farming is not a desirable profession. He considers it beneath his dignity and has already arranged everything for his son to emigrate. Joe is to go to New Jersey, which is just outside New York, to work in his uncle's deli.
Shortly thereafter, Hermann's other brothers, John and Teddy, also leave the island and go to New York.
It's to follow or go to hell.
Now you've heard Hermann's story and that of his brothers. As a young lad, Hermann is determined to become a sailor, against the wishes of his domineering father. You'll find out in the next episode whether his career aspirations come true. For now, let's fade over to Inge in New York and find out how things are going there. The 1920s in New York are the roaring 20s. And roaring they are. Proud, loud, wild, and weird. Highbrow and wacky. It was a wild decade, hence the name, characterized by dazzling parties and big band style swing music. New dances, such as the Charleston or the shimmy, conquered the dance floors. The women wear short dresses with embroidered beads and swinging fringes. They are self-confident and emancipated. Women have been allowed to vote in the USA since the early 1920s, but only white women. It was a decade of social, economic, and political change. The terrible First World War is over. Americans want to have fun, consume, and party. The economy is flourishing. The USA is now the richest country in the world. People finally have dollars in their pockets again and are spending them with their hands full. Many are investing in the stock market and making huge profits. They also have technological progress to thank for their new prosperity. The electric light illuminates the streets around Broadway, where theaters opened one after the other, and the billboards cast their bright lights onto the streets around Times Square. Architecturally, too, things are getting higher and higher in Manhattan. In 1930, the Chrysler Building is completed. With its gleaming Art Deco spire, it is 318 meters high, the tallest building in the world. Just 1 year later, the Empire State Building follows, 381 meters high, plus antenna. But not everything is glittering in New York these days. The alcohol soon stops flowing quite so freely at the parties. The government introduces prohibition. The sale, production, and transportation of alcoholic beverages is now prohibited by law. The aim is to combat vices such as prostitution and gambling. However, the ban leads to a sharp rise in illegal bars, so-called speakeasies. There, the corks are popping like there's no tomorrow.
And right in the middle of it all is my Urmam. Although she certainly didn't hang out in the speakeasies, she was still a child. But she could easily have crossed the path of a gangster like Lucky Luciano. In any case, the New York Mafia was booming in those days. It's possible. And the Frisians also formed their own mini-mafia, as I have heard. They are said to have been supplied with drugs by the friends from Föhr during Prohibition. Allegedly, cans of teal, a small type of duck that is traditionally caught on Föhr, were sent with a double bottom. That's how alcohol was smuggled to New York. And if you bought a can of the export hit in a Föhr deli in New York, you got your booze with it. I wonder if Inge's parents offered these special cans in their deli. Robert Klei from the Ferring Foundation told me what everyday life was like for Clara and Revert as typical Föhr deli owners back then.
The men were basically in the store selling from 7 in the morning until 10 at night, right up till closing. The shop had to be profitable. It often went like this. First, you were a clerk for an acquaintance, or an uncle, or something like that in New York. And then at some point you got the opportunity to take over a store yourself. And at the time the women stood in the back of the kitchen and cooked the recipes and made the food that was to be sold at the front. I've also seen pictures where the children are sitting in the back of the kitchen on some counter or so on. And the women are standing there in twos or threes, cutting countless kilos of potatoes, which can then be processed.
The employees rarely have time off. At least one day a week is reserved for the family. Mother Clara always finds things to do in her free time in New York. Inge remembers that.
My mother had every Tuesday off, and my mother always took us children somewhere. And my mother always wanted to experience a lot. We always went to the beach and the amusement parks. My father had every Monday off from work. He met up with other men who were here from Föhr, cousins and so on, his age, and they went out to eat, and what else they did, I don't know.
The bond that holds the Föhrer community together is the Föhrer und Armbrümer Kranken- und Unterstützungsverein von New York und Umgegend. And this is where our Süderende comes into play, whose strawberries were stolen by the village boys at the beginning of this chapter. Tedure Jappen. She also lives in New York for a while and ran the Jappen Brothers Saloon with her husband. And it wasn't just any bar. The Föhrer und Armbrümer Sick Support Association was founded here in 1884. The mission of the club was clear: combat loneliness and homesickness.
It was founded in the Jappen Brothers Saloon in Brooklyn. They were immigrants from Föhr, and in this saloon the men from Föhr met for a beer and had a chat in Ferring. You know, there's no health insurance in New York or in America. And so the idea was to join forces and set up their own small health insurance scheme. Everyone puts money in, and if someone gets sick, the support is there.
Actually, we're all familiar with associations like this. They exist in every city, established by the people who have emigrated there. They create a piece of home in a foreign country. New York was and is a melting pot of cultures. People from all over the world live here in areas with names like Chinatown, Little Italy, or Little Brazil. It is said that you can hear more than 800 different languages in New York City. This also makes New York the world capital of languages, and so it is only logical that the people of Föhr also brought their little piece of home with them to the Big Apple. In the middle of this huge city, the Harlem district is something very special in its own right. Inge lives here with her family.
There were 3 houses in our street. Only white people lived there, and the others were all black.
Yes, back then there was still so-called racial segregation, where the segregation of white and black people was regulated by law. This also included housing. That is unimaginable from today's perspective. For Ullmann and her family, it was probably normal back then.
At that time, 80% of Harlem's population is black. African Americans from the southern states come here to escape racism and the terror of the Ku Klux Klan with its hate speech and lynchings. They also find better job opportunities here in the north. This movement is called the Great Migration and is the largest internal migration in the history of the U.S. Their destinations: the Midwest, California, and the Northeast, such as the area around New York. Harlem is a hotbed of change in the 1920s. An estimated 150,000 black people live here and develop a new consciousness. This gave rise to what is known today as the Harlem Renaissance.
I spoke about that to my friend Harald Casido. He is musicologist, author, and saxophonist. Harald lived in the US for a long time and did his doctorate and taught at Columbia University. He said an important aim of the Harlem Renaissance was to counter certain ideas, to fight against common representation of African American people in the US. Harald said the Harlem Renaissance is a movement of African American artists and intellectuals across various artistic disciplines, including science, with the aim of creating an independent African American culture. When I went to New York for the first time in 2008 to visit the places where my family used to live, I was amazed. When I turned right from my great-grandparents' deli in Harlem at the next street corner, my eyes fell on a huge yellow sign with red letters, Apollo Theater. Wow, I thought, that really is only a stone's throw away. The Apollo opened in 1928, just 1 year after Ullmann arrived here with her family. As a musician, the Apollo is well known to me. And even today, it is one of the famous stages in the US for black artists. Stars like Billie Holiday and Sarah Vaughan got their start here. And later, greats like Marvin Gaye, James Brown, the Jackson 5 and Diana Ross performed here. In my mind's eye, I can see great-grandmother Clara handing Billie Holiday or Duke Ellington a sandwich over the counter and saying, "I wish you a good show tonight." Well, theoretically, it could have been like that.
While the last guests stumble out of the Apollo in the early hours of the morning and are greeted by the rising sun, Inge and her parents are already busy with first salads and sandwiches in the deli. Inge explores Harlem together with her friends. They roam the streets, climb over walls and fences, wander through backyards, and discover the neighborhood in their own way.
Makeup, mirror, lipstick in the road. Run out of the window, jump the fence and go. Then one day I run into the gang of friends.
And we used to sit in front of my father's store on Sunday mornings when the black people came by. They were so well dressed, those women, in evening dresses, and they glittered. So that was really great.
To be done, every girl is mighty proud in Harlem.
But there was also a house on our street. I thought, that's weird. You only see men going in there. I only know that it was a whorehouse. We had a backyard, and we always found so much makeup and stuff. That was from the women, wasn't it? We thought that was great, of course.
Interesting. So Ulman lived next door to a brothel as a child. That really is a stark contrast to Hermann's childhood on Föhr.
Most people in Harlem live a fairly middle-class life. They have nothing to do with wild parties, jazz, and the mafia. But those dark streets do exist. A few blocks north of the Ketelsens' Frisian Deli, there is an establishment that does not mean anything to a child like Inge. At the corner of 142nd Street and Lenox Avenue, there is a legendary nightclub that is one of a kind in what concerns its contradictions and tendency towards illegality.
Harold Kisido described to me what it was like back then. He said, painted on the wall of the Cotton Club was the image of a mansion from the southern states. There were quarters of enslaved people in the background, so the name Cotton Club also alludes directly to slavery in the southern states.
In the Cotton Club, the blacks are there to entertain the whites. They serve the drinks. The dancers must not be older than 21 and must be at least 5 feet tall. They must be black, but as light-skinned as possible. On stage are black artists without exception. In the audience, only whites. Black people are not allowed to enter. The white high society from Midtown or downtown Manhattan can be driven to Harlem very close to the Ketelsens' Deli, not to buy sandwiches, but to party and to take part in their exotic idea of black culture. There is even a term for this, slumming. This is the term used when people visit a lower social class than their own out of curiosity or for entertainment. One could also call it slum tourism. Although this was already racist to the max back then, the stage at the Cotton Club was also a springboard to global fame for many musicians.
Duke Ellington's breakthrough came from playing at the Cotton Club. The live performances at the club were broadcasted nationwide on the radio, which helped Ellington become what we would call a celebrity today. Yes, and my grandpa, Hermann Rickmers, was also into this sound. I found a few jazz records from that time in his record collection.
The Cotton Club is a prime example of white businessmen taking over and marketing black music and culture, and making tidy profits from it. However, in order to reach the large markets of buyers in the US and Europe, some players were more suitable than others. Benny Goodman went down in history as the king of swing, and Paul Whiteman as the king of jazz, and Elvis is the so-called king of rock and roll. What do all three have in common? They're all white, and they each had a sound that was first created by black musicians.
Wow, that's some tough stuff. This reminds me of a song that I listened to a lot in my youth. It's Fight the Power by Public Enemy, who are also from New York. Incidentally, Fight the Power is not about fighting the state. It's about fighting the abuse of power.
Most of my heroes don't appear on those stamps. Sample a look back, you look and find nothing but rednecks for 400 years if you check. Chuck D, frontman for the rap group Public Enemy, firmly declares that his heroes never appeared on stamps. And that the official history for the last 400 years was written by white men. Word.
We got to fight the powers that be. Fight power. Fight the power. Fight the power. Fight the power.
Power. By the way, hip-hop originated in New York, in the Bronx. And it's precisely this neighborhood that Inge's family moves to in the next and third episode. You'll also find out how Inge experienced the borough back then. We also spent a summer on the island of Föhr. This is where Inge and Hermann meet for the first time. That was the second episode of Föhr to New York, an immigration story. If you have any suggestions or feedback, please check the show notes for my email address. Föhr to New York is a podcast by Honig&Gold in cooperation with the Ferring Foundation. I am Bente Faust. Production Honig&Gold. Idea, book and direction Daniel Hauptmann and me, Bente Faust. Music and sound design Boy Cassidy. Project management Ferring Foundation Robert Klei. Research Daniel Hauptmann, Bente Faust and Kreske Ingwersen. Fact-checking Yves Müller and Ute Maack. Cover illustration Jana Alu. Recorded at Off Your Tree Studio in Hamburg. Speakers Morgan Finlay, Valerie von Hornbach, Jeremiah Costello. Translation Inke Rickmers and Morgan Finlay. You can find the podcast also in a German and a Ferring version.